So, hi, welcome to a new part of our Make It Your Own series where we're going to be exploring the Pawsby curriculum, which is for age 7 to 11. And I've got with me Liz Williams today, who is a very, very well known Mindfulness in Schools project trainer. I'm sure lots of you that have done your Pawsby training will have come across Liz. If not, in a Pawsby training, you may have come across her in other sessions that she's delivered for MISP. So a really warm welcome, Liz. Thank you for being here. I wonder if you could share with everybody how you have delivered Pawsby.
Well, I didn't come across this until I'd actually retired. So I am on a soapbox. People have to watch out because the late converters are always the worst there. But it meant I wasn't in a school to be able to teach in my own school there. So I go into schools. I'm a helicopter teacher, if you like, in that respect, but I've been into lots of schools locally, including Welsh medium. And I've delivered Pawsby sometimes to all classes from year 3 up to year 6. And sometimes the school has chosen a particular year group that they'd like me to work with. So it's really interesting because the differentiation, the difference between what you get from year 3 and what you get from children of 6, it is so interesting. But it works every time. Every time, it's always blown away. I always get reinforced that yes, this really does work.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for sharing that, Liz. Just to say that I've also taught this as an independent teacher many, many times in the local area that I live, because I'm actually a secondary trained teacher. And it was my first kind of excursion, as it were, into teaching primary age children when I delivered the Pawsby curricula that made me go, oh, I really wish I'd been in primary school all these years, because I absolutely loved it. I loved secondary as well, but there was just something about primary and the way that they received this curricula that made me think, oh, if only I could do this full time for a living. We're going to be looking at the first 2 lessons of Pawsby. So there are 12 lessons in total for any of you who are out there who've not come across this curricula. And they come in pairs, so they share themes and ideas. And these 2 lessons are all around the prefrontal cortex and how that supports us. So just wondered, Liz, you were saying about your way into talking about the brain and the mind, just a little bit different from how it's described in our notes that we get given. So just interested to hear a bit more about that.
Well, there's a couple of things. Partly I'm going in generally to a class I don't know. So I need to do a little bit of warm up, but also I'm really into as much 3D as you can get. So the slides are amazing, but we're talking about complex concepts here. So I like to do a little bit of 3D when I can there. So I usually take in a brain.
Nice.
And another brain. And I look for someone to volunteer who's a good sport. And I don't know why, but it's nearly always a boy that is put forward as the good sport, and just get them to come up. And I talk about which brain do you think is the right fit. And depending on how much of a good sport, they'll often choose this one. But that just gives us a bit of a chance to have a bit of a laugh, and then a talk that coming down to it is probably this one. Okay, this is weighs about £3. And I have never demonstrated the weight, Kate, but you're going to talk to us, I know about that.
Well, just I can say it here really is that one of the things that I do is take in a bag of either flour or sugar that weighs about £3, just so that everyone can feel how heavy that is. Because obviously this lovely brain that you've got, that you're holding, is quite light, isn't it?
It's very spongy. You wouldn't believe what sort of animals they think have a brain that size, but there we go. But then I say, well, it's so interesting, isn't it? That one's grey and this one is red. And if I think I can get away with it, I say this is because this one's fresh. I got it donated by the class I was in yesterday, but I might need another fresh one at the end of this there. So I'll be looking for someone to donate me a fresh brain to take to my next class, which they probably think is really corny. But you don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps. So I just established then that we all have one of these. This is the point about this, isn't we all have one of these. And whoever the good sport has been there, he's got one of these in his head, and it's protected by his skull. It's inside there, but we all have one of these that's inside our head. But then I've established the concept that the brain is an organ that sits in our head before we've even started really on the course there. I'd probably show the first slide because that's got a picture of a brain on it. So I'd have the first slide up, but then would go into just doing that activity just to hopefully warm them up. Usually works. And if they think I'm mad, well, I hope that helps.
Yeah. And you were sharing earlier with me around like the different ways that you demonstrate the difference between the brain and the mind.
Well, that's the next question, isn't it? You know, so we've established that the brain is an organ that sits in the head. And okay, where is your mind? So we know our brain's there. Where's the mind? And then you'll get lots of people who go straight to the same place, and then you get some, well, not quite so sure. There we go. So I let that lie then, and would go on and say, okay, you're not quite so sure about whether they're the same thing. If I said, I've made up my brain, does that sound right? You get some puzzled looks. You know? But if I say, I've made up my mind, what about that? And then they look much more relieved there. Oh, that's interesting. So maybe they're not quite the same. And then I say, what if I said, my brain is wandering? And of course, we've just established that it's there in our head, safely inside our skulls. But if I say my mind is wandering, is that okay? So that's the warm up then to say, do you know what? There is something different. Our minds are a bit different. And I've introduced the fact that our mind can go somewhere else then. And then I would do the clapping exercise and get them to focus on where is their mind after we've done the clapping and they've got the tingles. I think that just, I'm using that to reinforce the fact that our mind can be somewhere else, our mind can be directed somewhere. And all of this is such complex concepts that we're introducing. But I think it's physical again, isn't it, when we do the clapping? Physical examples there. And I think it's that 3D-ness, it's bringing it to life in terms of what we're teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a bit of fun there, which I think is really important. By giving the opposite idea, it doesn't sound right, does it? So there's a little bit of no, that can't be right. Yeah, nice. And we know, of course, that the students learn about the brain the whole way through a Pawsby course. And in this session, we talk about neuroplasticity, so this ability of the brain to change its structure, the different things that we know help do that, the different sorts of learning. And I know that you particularly emphasise the two people stood together as one of the things that we learn about that changes the brain.
When we're looking at training the muscles of our mind, and the examples are things like playing an instrument, playing sport, reading and writing, and they're sort of obvious things that we use our brain for, but they're important. They're ones to emphasize, but the last one seems to stand on its own. And I think this is part of the life enhancing things of mindfulness there, and that it helps us be better friends, it helps us in relationships, it helps us better with our friends and our brothers and sisters and anyone we come into contact with. And I just say, look at the little people on the screen and they look quite happy together, don't they? And this is nice there. And so maybe we can use training the muscles of our mind to help us be nicer to each other as well.
Yeah, and that sort of connects in with something that I know you think is really important in terms of what we emphasize about what mindfulness can support us with, which is flourishing, as well as things that feel a bit tricky. And you mentioned before about the noticing happiness slide, and I just wonder if you'd like just fill us in a little bit on what you do there as well.
And in this lesson, it's on its own, but we come back to it again and again, and with kindness and curiosity, and then with actual happiness later on in the course there. But I feel very strongly, and I do this with adult teaching as well there, that it's too easy to think, oh, mindfulness is just going to help us cope. No, that's important. If we're not coping, nothing else happens. But that whole connection and relationships is really important. So I'd say that was the second. First is coping, second is connection, belonging, and that's where our two little friends and how it helps us with relationships come in. And the next one is flourishing, and the fact that it's life enhancing, and it helps us to awe and wonder, trust, compassion, gratitude, kindness, all of those attitudes that it helps us to develop that are actually about growing happiness and being nicer to each other and to ourselves. And the last one I would put in there is it helps us to make better decisions. if we can be mindful, if we can rescue ourselves from amygdala hijacks and all the rest of it there, then we're going to make wiser decisions about what we do next. And all of that means we flourish, and we have a flourishing life. So I think what I'm trying to do is to not let mindfulness just be something that's about coping.
Yeah.
Important though that is, there's all the richness that we've got coming on down the line in the rest of the lessons that I think are so important, especially for what life is like for our kids today.
Yeah, you're making me think about the fact that sometimes people think it's also just attention training, which is part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And it's also not about kind of being quiet and being still, which is again another thing that sometimes is a misconception out there about what it is. And what's really lovely about what you've just described is just the real richness of what practicing mindfulness can bring to our lives. So thank you for sharing that, because it was just really lovely for me to have that kind of more holistic explanation of how important the attitudes are through all of this. And of course, they come through right from the beginning of a Paws Be course. They're there right at the start. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to share, by the way, around the muscle training bit of this, and there's those of you that will have seen Paws Be will have seen that we've got like a little brain that's working out with weights. And I sometimes, and again, this really does depend on the classroom that I'm in, because some of the classrooms around near where I live, they're often rural schools, very tiny, etc. But if there is room, I sometimes get the students to turn sideways on so that they can't knock into each other, but then demonstrate the arm coming out and coming back in as if you're working a muscle, and get them to feel their muscle working. And say, imagine we've got this idea of the brain being a muscle, and it works every time our mind wanders and we bring it back. And then I reinforce that when we come to do the practice at the end of this lesson. So when it comes to the actual practice, is there anything there that's different for you?
It's something that I bring forward from a future lesson there, because in the picture on the slide there, our little friend, when we're doing counting breaths, has got his or her their hands on their lap there. And I have started now bringing forward tummy and chest breathing. So I get them to put themselves in their bubble, because I love that. That sensation of being able to just create your own space is just such a lovely concept there. But then I would invite them to put one hand on their tummy and one hand on their chest. So we're still going to tune into the breath, and we're still going to count the breaths here, but I'm emphasizing the touch, the movement, and might get them to choose whether perhaps they choose to concentrate on their chest or their tummy there. But that's where they're doing their counting, when they're breathing, and with the hand moving. And because there's something more physical, it's more sensory about that one there. Just conscious about checking out. At this point, we haven't done a practice, so I haven't had a chance to check out with anyone. And it is very rare, but there just is a possibility that the breath will be triggering. And this is giving me a chance to find out, isn't it, if it is. I didn't say it's quite rare, but I've had it more in adult classes there, where the breath is uncomfortable. And that could be because you've got asthma, it could be because it's an actual trauma situation that is triggering or whatever. So if you introduce the physicality of the chest or tummy moving with the breath, then you are dissipating that to a certain extent. And so I still want them to breathe. This is health and safety, still keep breathing, but maybe not whole emphasis on the breath. And this is certainly until you've had a chance to just suss out whether there is anything. Because even if you've talked to the class teacher before, it's likely they won't know. If they have anything in this line before, they won't know if there should be anything like that. And I just feel I just need to make sure, as we've become more and more aware, that this is a slightly more trauma sensitive practice, just to introduce the hands and the tummy. And it is quite hard to concentrate on the breath. So it gives you an extra one anyway, as we introduced further on. I've introduced it here.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think probably just important to say, in terms of trauma-informed practice, that this is something that we've learned more and more about in recent years. And if anyone's interested, that they can go and perhaps have a look at David Treleaven and his website. So just naming that here for anyone who would like to perhaps go and have a look. And just to say that on a previous Make It Your Own video, when we were talking about .B, I mentioned as well, Tim Durden did a talk on trauma-informed practice for mindfulness Wales, and that was just excellent. Really recommend having a look at it if you want to know more about trauma-informed practice.
Yeah, it's really practical. Just a few hints that are just about, just as I've just talked about there. It's not about not doing the practice because you want it to be as accessible for everybody, but it's just a couple of things you can think about as you're introducing the practice that are really easy to put in, that just know that you're being more trauma sensitive, more sensitive.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to move into lesson 2 now, and just wondered if there's anything that kind of pops out for you here in particular, that you teach in a particular way that's a Liz way of doing it.
I do have some fun with concentration. I'm sure I'm not the only one on this there, but we have a bit of a play with what's our concentration face, and there's usually a laugh to be had out about that. What's our concentration body? What's our concentrating body? How does that feel? How do we sit when we're really concentrating? And I might choose objects around the room if they've got paper and pen on the table, although I always prefer not to. But it might get somebody to write something. I might get someone, if there's another good sport there, I might get someone to come out and show us their concentrating face and their concentrating body so that we can talk about that. And then, so it's expression, body language, so we're how we are and concentrating. And I might ask them how it feels, because actually it's quite hard work. Over those moments that we're concentrating, they're noticing that they might even say my head hurts or things like that, because it is, we do have to work quite hard to concentrate. So just have a little bit of fun with concentrating, which hopefully helps to reinforce what exactly it is we're talking about, because it's easy to throw words around and think we're all talking about the same thing. Very often we're not.
Yeah, and I quite like to normalise the fact that concentrating also looks different on different people. Like you were just saying about just exploring, noticing that all of that difference that could come out of those discussions can just be really helpful for normalising the fact that we might not all look at something rigidly. It might be that we look away and we come back, and we look away and we come back, that there's different ways that we might concentrate on something. And then hopefully for young people who might struggle with just resting their attention on one thing solidly, that will normalise that for them, and they recognise that they've just got a different way of concentrating. How about then, so just to say that we deliver training, and Liz is one of our lovely trainers on Pawsby. We deliver training all over the world. And when we deliver training to people who are overseas, we often say, if you want to use a different story from Goldilocks that works better in your context and still demonstrates somebody making lots of choices that have consequences, then to go for that. So that's just to say that naturally, automatically, we recognise there might be a cultural reason for wanting to use a different story. But I'm just interested to know whether or not you use Goldilocks, Liz.
I do use Goldilocks, but I don't assume that even if I'm in a local school that they all know the story. And of course, there are various versions of it there. So I don't tell a long version of the story, but I do get a version of the story, though, so that we're all talking about the same sorts of things. So if I think they remember parts of the story, then I will ask questions about what happened in the beginning, what did she do next, and I try and get as much of the story from them. But it enables me to make sure I put in the things that are the choice points. That even if I'm eliciting the story as much as I can from them there, I can talk about the fact that she's standing outside this house and she chooses to go in, and I can talk about there being 3 bowls of porridge, 3 chairs, 3 beds, and we can talk about the sequence and make sure that the choices she's making are part of the current experience in the classroom that we're in at the moment there, so that they're on secure ground then when I get them to discuss on their tables what are the choices she made there. And I might even, depending on the class, I might even give some hints about why she might have done things, so that I'm warming them up to have that conversation, so that we're all working from the same, more or less, truncated version of the story. Before we go on to the questions that I would give them a chance to talk in their groups about,
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that I've always used Goldilocks as well. I found it works really well, even with a range. Sometimes people will say, does Goldilocks work well with 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, etc.? But I think because it is the case that a lot of children will have heard the story or a version of the story, that it's almost like muscle memory. It's there still for a lot of children. And it's just funny to flip it with those questions, like you were saying there, that kind of raises discussion about what choices that Goldilocks makes and the consequences of those choices. And one of the things that I have had some great learning about have been around children saying quite difficult things actually in relation to what makes Goldilocks go into the house in the first place, around wanting to get away from a drug dealing parent or wanting to be away from home for whatever reason. And that's then really supported a follow-up discussion around the fact that sometimes our choices are there because our body's leading us. We might be cold, we might be tired, we might be hungry, and that's a good thing to listen to our bodies in terms of those choices that we make, that they lead us in those choices. So not to always think that we necessarily have, I suppose, conscious control over this. Just wondered then, in terms of the last exercise in that lesson, which is all around how many choices have you made in a day, just to summarise, we had a discussion earlier where you were saying that you don't tend to use magnet hands, and I was saying that I do. And just to say that magnet hands is a very practical thing that's part of an update that we did, where you have the option to move around the classroom and children move around and put their hands together to name a choice and then move around again and do that. So you could make it a little bit more mobile. That might, again, not work in your setting. But Liz, you were saying that you don't tend to do that. Do you want to just share a little bit more about why?
It's not because it's not a lovely activity, it is, but by this time, inevitably in this one, I'm running out of time. And of course, I'm going in and it's coming up playtime or whatever time I've been allocated in the classroom there. So I'm running out of time. So I go straight to the choices you've made today and get them to discuss that on their tables, their learning partners, and have a good chat about what choices they've made today, because that gives me more control of the time, basically, because then I can ask for examples. And the follow-up questions I'm looking for are, did you do that because you will always do it? Did you have to think about it, or was that something that you really had to decide? And how long did it take you to decide what you were going to wear or do or whatever it was? And you usually get some good examples. But even if I'm stuck for time, that gives me a little bit more control. And I would love to get them wandering around the classroom, but that's another 5 minutes, isn't it, by the time you've got them up and sat back down again and then had the conversation. So I tend to stick to the conversation because this is so interesting, and it links back to Goldilocks about just the degrees of choices we make. And of course, it's actually setting us up for autopilot when we get to lesson 4, that sometimes you just have that for breakfast because you always have it for breakfast. And of course, that comes up later on there. So I do tend to keep a little bit more control out of that so I can get the feedback from around the classroom, and I can do as much or as little as I've got time for to make the teaching point about the choices you've made today, and just how many choices. Just look how many choices there are in this room that we've already made today, and it's only 10 o'clock.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining me for this session. It's been really lovely to hear about the ways, your way of delivering it, and the different settings that you've worked in. So much appreciated. Thank you, Liz. Thank you.